Wake up. It's the Sleep Unplugged podcast, episode 115, Insomnia and Sleep Debt. Pay it back. Welcome, everyone, to the Sleep Unplugged podcast. My name is Chris Winder. I'm a neurologist, sleep specialist, and your host for this episode of the podcast. It's the first Monday of September. Happy Labor Day. If you're celebrating that today, when you're listening to it, it's been a long summer. I'm ready for the heat to end. So I hope you're enjoying the nice 3-day weekend with friends, family, and people you care about. If you're new to the podcast, welcome. If you're a veteran of the Sleep Unplugged podcast, welcome back. Excited that you're here. My name is Chris Winter. You can always get in touch with me through my social media, Dr. Chris Winter Twitter, Dr. Chris Winter Instagram. We have a YouTube page where we post the videos of all of our content. And we also have the Spotify Sleep Unplugged music playlists where we talk about a little bit of music at the top of every show. And the song that we feature, we put into the Spotify playlist so you can grill your sausages and hamburgers for your Labor Day weekend and put on Sleep Unplugged Volume 2 and listen to all that great music, or Volume 1. Volume 3, we are currently putting together right now, so that might be a bit shorter of a playlist. We always start off with comments, corrections, and criticisms. And for longtime listeners of the show, you know that we upset Kathleen if we talk too long. Last week, we definitely talked too long before we got to the meat of the podcast. So we're going to keep it very short. I posted a lot of content last week about Lana Del Rey, Leonard Cohen, about the Chelsea Hotel. And so Lisa wrote, "Have you stayed at the Chelsea Hotel?" It's actually the Hotel Chelsea now. They've kind of changed the name around a little bit. And no, I have not, but I have plans to do it. I always just, somebody else is paying for me to come to New York or whatnot. It just never works out. But my daughter lives there. She produces the show Maeve. And one of these days when I stay there, I will stay at the Chelsea Hotel, even though it's kind of far from where Maeve is. A really quick correction from last week's podcast. We briefly mentioned the supergroup Power Station that featured some of the members of Duran Duran, and I accidentally said it featured Andy and Roger Taylor. It did not feature Roger Taylor, their drummer. It featured Andy Taylor, who played guitar, and John Taylor, cover boy John Taylor, who played bass. So real quick correction there. This week's song, Pay It Back, is a reference to the unbelievable musical artist Declan Patrick McManus, otherwise known as Elvis Costello. He changed his name to DP Costello because it was too hard to say Declan McManus on the telephone. People always misunderstood what his name was, so he changed it to DP Costello, but over time wanted to pay homage to Elvis and kind of shake it up. And so he rebranded himself Elvis Costello. And Pay It Back was a song off of his debut album, which is a classic in sort of the new wave scene, which was My Aim Is True. That song is a classic and gives me goosebumps every time I hear it. His initial backing group was a group that went on to become a group called Clover, but they were uncredited at the time when he recorded My Aim Is True. And Clover's claim to fame is that it featured several artists that would later become Huey Lewis in the News, including Huey Lewis, who at the time spelt his last name Louis. He would later change his last name to Lewis. Elvis Costello eventually dumped Clover as the backing band. He wanted to shake it up, adopt more of a new wave sound, and sort of put together a band that would become the Attractions. Recorded at Headley Grange, which we talked about with Led Zeppelin. That's where they recorded where the levee breaks. We talked about that in the previous podcast. At the time, My Aim Is True was the best-selling import album at the time. And on the US version of My Aim Is True was the song Watching the Detectives, which is a great song. It was not part of the original My Aim Is True release in Great Britain. Really quickly, we've talked a lot about the Chelsea Hotel, but I can't not mention the fact that on Elvis Costello's next album, there was the single, and that was this year's model, which we actually talked about in a previous episode too. There was a song called I Don't Want to Go Back to Chelsea. And in another Chelsea related trivia question, Edie Sedgwick, who we talked about in episode 110, actually lived at the Chelsea Hotel for a period of time. She was the model featured in the cult song Edie Ciao Baby. She actually accidentally set her room on fire at the Chelsea Hotel. So we're moving on to the meat and potatoes of the podcast. And hopefully Kathleen will be really happy, as my wife, who always fast forwards the beginning of the podcast because she says I talk too much. So I thought, because it's the first Monday of the month, and we always do a topic related to insomnia the first Monday of the month, I really thought it would be cool to talk about sleep debt. And I'll tell you how this kind of came about. The European Society of Cardiology's Congress met this year, and there was an interesting research paper that came out of it just a couple of days ago that a reporter called me up and said, could I ask you some questions about this new research that's embargoed? So you're not allowed to talk about it until it's released to the public, which it has been now. And it was all about sleep debt. And I thought, oh my gosh, we're episode 115. We haven't even talked about sleep debt yet. So this would be a great topic, not only for the podcast, but also for insomnia. So, sleep debt is the idea that if we stay up late tonight, on Monday, Memorial Day, I'm sorry, Labor Day, I keep saying Memorial Day, Monday, Labor Day, we stay up really late, but we have to get up on Tuesday and actually go to work and get some stuff done and make some money. We incur a bit of a sleep debt. Maybe we only sleep 5 hours. We are up till 2 o'clock in the morning cleaning up from the big barbecue, and we have to be up at 7, so we slept 5 hours. But we need really closer to 7 on average day to day. So we've accrued a little two hour sleep debt. And so this research, the head author, Yenjin Song, was basically looking at 90,000 subjects that were involved in the UK biobank project and trying to understand the relationship between their compensated weekend sleep and heart disease specifically. So they're looking at all of this through accelerometer data, and they grouped these 90,000 subjects into quartiles based upon their amount of compensated sleep. So group one had the least compensated sleep, group two a little bit more, group three, and group four had the most compensatory sleep. I think group four was somewhere in the order of 1 to 16 hours of compensatory sleep, somewhere in that during the weekend. So in the study, self-reporting fewer than 7 hours per night was defined as being sleep deprived. So of those 90,000 subjects, about 19,000 or 22% of those individuals were defined in the study as being sleep deprived. And while certainly the other 80% of the individuals in the study could have periods, a night here and there of sleep deprivation, they didn't meet the criteria for sort of that overall sleep deprivation. So then they're looking at hospitalization records, causes of death, cardiac disease, heart attacks, high blood pressure, AFib, stroke, and trying to match up which of these groups is having more negative cardiovascular outcomes. So the data set was not only profound in terms of the number of subjects, 90,000, but also pretty robust in terms of how long these individuals were followed, with a follow-up period of almost 14 years in the group with the most compensatory sleep. And so what they found was the more compensatory sleep you had on the weekend, the less likely you were to develop heart-related disease in those quartiles. And it was something like 19% less in those individuals. So in the subgroup of patients with daily sleep deprivation, those with the most compensatory sleep had about a 20% lower risk of developing heart disease versus the people who were not making up their sleep. And this tracks with other research that we often talk about. In fact, I've written 2 books, The Sleep Solution, Why Your Sleep's Broken, How to Fix It, as well as The Rested Child. In both of those books, I talk about sleep debt and studies that sort of look at that kind of thing. There was another study in 2017. It was called Sleep Duration and Mortality. Does Weekend Sleep Matter? They looked at, in this, it was a cohort of 43,880 subjects, followed for 13 years, a very similar sort of study makeup. And then among the individuals who were less than 65 years of age and exhibited short sleep, which they considered fewer, 5 hours or fewer during weekends at baseline, associated with a 52% higher mortality rate related to the reference group that was making up the sleep on the weekend. So a study, which was Swiss, it was a Swedish study, I believe, that basically the conclusion was if you were making up the sleep on the weekend that you lost during the week, you seem to live as long as the people who are getting the perfect amount, 7 hours of sleep every day. So this kind of creates in me what I've always talked about as being the sleep credit card. I like the idea of the sleep credit card because what I'm saying with the sleep credit card is you can acquire debt if you'd like, meaning that if something is keeping you from getting the sleep you need tonight, you're going to acquire a debt. So tonight we're having a great time, Labor Day up until 2 o'clock because our friends are here. We don't get to see them that often. The burgers taste great. The pool feels great on this hot summer night. And we don't want it to end, but it does finally end at 2 o'clock. So we stagger to work the next day. Sleep debt is the reason why we've got to make the Monday after the Super Bowl some kind of holiday, right? Same reason. We're all going to stay up watching the Super Bowl. So it'd be nice to not have to go to work the next day. So anyway, we accrue that Super Bowl sleep debt, that Labor Day sleep debt, whatever. So the idea to me is that when we're thinking about that sleep debt, how are we kind of rectifying it in terms of, how we can sort of rationalize it? And this reminds me of another study that a friend of mine just sent me. And the study basically said something like, the title of the article, it was not the study, this was the title of a news article about research. And it said something like, why one night of less than optimal sleep might hurt your health. So that's difficult, isn't it? Place to be in where, number one, do we need that article? Does anybody think that, bad sleep, smoking one cigarette, eating a greasy cheeseburger is doing something positive for your health? Of course, it probably is negative. I mean, my guess is, smoking one cigarette takes away 13 seconds of your life. I'm completely making that up. I'm sure it has some sort of consequence that maybe we're not able to measure as mere humans, but there's probably some sort of negative It's like the research about alcohol, right? The New York Times just came out and said, look, basically, no amount of alcohol is good for you. Any amount of alcohol is probably negative. And for people who, socially drink every now and then, you might be shortening your life 4 to 6 days. It was something like that. And the author that was, doing the podcast who had done all this research was kind of like, yeah, I'm definitely going to drink if it's just going to, I will pay the penalty of 5 days off the end of my life to go out with friends, have a good time, tailgate, and drink responsibly. Like it's okay with me. Now, you have breast cancer in your family and you're worried about alcohol accelerating. That might be a different metric. So we add in all the variables and it changes things. So when you think about sleep debt, how can we make sleep debt? How can we rationalize it? And this is the sleep debt credit card, meaning that when I look at the research, I think that it is okay to accrue a sleep debt that's small as long as you're paying it back quickly. And while I can't give you great definitive numbers about that, and anybody who's telling you they've got definitive numbers are lying to you. But I can tell you, I feel fairly confident that if you accrue that sleep debt tonight, Labor Day Monday, as long as you find those 2 hours you lost at some point in the next week, I think all of these studies that have come out, and there's more. I mean, 2008, recovery of cognitive performance from sleep debt, does a short rest period pause and a single recovery night help? Yes, it does. 2023, insufficient sleep and weekend recovery sleep, classification by mental metabolomics based machine learning on so yes. I mean, all these studies, there's another 2020 study, effects of recovery sleep on pain perception, a systematic review. Basically, it's saying, yeah, if we recover our sleep over one or maybe more than one weekend, we can lower pain indices, all kinds of great health outcomes. So to me, charge your debt when your friend's in town, when the party's happening, when you're, the midnight showing of Rocky Horror Picture Show and you love to get dressed up like Janet and go do the whole thing with the squirt guns, then do it. Okay, it's 2 o'clock in the morning. You have to go to work tomorrow. You got 5 hours of sleep. So now you've charged something on the sleep credit card I've given you. You've got 7 days to pay off that debt. And if you do, nothing bad happens. No interest, no fees, no finance charge. It's like it never happened. So, it's like the responsible use of credit, right? And it always irritates me, the sleep debt hardliner. No amount of sleep debt is healthy. Well, great. Fucking what world are you living in where you're not going to have episodes of sleep debt? Your kid calls, from college and they're really struggling and you stay up talking to them. Your loved one is sick and you're kind of taking care of them throughout the night. You're a shift worker. You've worked 2 jobs. I mean, there's sleep debt is going to happen. We just have to come at it responsibly. I was just having this great conversation with the person that I'm staying with here. I'm back in Charlottesville, back in the hometown, hanging out with my buddy Mark. Mark's a psychologist type, a mental health social worker, clinician, practitioner, and he's fantastic at his job. And he also happens to be a fish fan. And I thought, we haven't featured fish on the show. And I'm not a huge Fish fan. I like a couple of their songs. I listened to a little bit in college, but I don't have that following that a lot of people do. But I think we got to put this in there. And Mark was telling me something he tells his patients and clients. It was the fuya, no fuya. It's kind of like not. I'm not going to say it. I try not to say the F word, but fuya, fuya, and it's an acronym for forgot you were human. And I think sometimes we've got to remember that we're human and humans will have difficulty falling asleep some nights. They'll have obstacles to their sleep. And I think it's okay. Like, yeah, something happened and you didn't get the sleep you needed. Your flight was delayed. And so now you're going to imagine that sleep credit card. And it's your job over the next 6, 7 days to find that sleep you lost. Now, very quickly, let's move to insomnia. Why is this important? I think it's important because we have to look at sleep debt in a couple different ways, meaning that there's two different people, we'll call them Karen and Mark. Karen went to bed at 11 o'clock and it took her 4 hours to fall asleep. So she didn't, got in bed at 11, had all the opportunity. The bed was there. It was comfortable. It was dark, cool. Nobody's snoring. No, puppies that need to go be released to go to the bathroom. And she just had a lot on her mind, thinking about some things, travel upcoming, older parents, and it just took her a while to fall asleep. So she fell asleep eventually, got up the next day, went to work. Did she accrue a sleep debt? Sort of, yes. Now again, we're going to take out perceptions and things. Maybe she slept a little bit more than that, and it really wasn't, 4 hours before she fell asleep. But yeah, she accrued a little bit of a debt. I think for some people, like like our imaginary Karen, the sleep debt needs to work for you. In other words, if Karen says, okay, well, I've lost 4 hours, now I've got to make it up somewhere else. If difficulty falling asleep, if insomnia is something that Karen's been dealing with a long time, it might not be the wisest idea to pay back those 4 hours, meaning that, okay, she got through her day of work, she got home around 4. I'm going to take a nap at 4 o'clock, sleep 4 hours, wake up at 8, and now I've repaid my sleep debt and I can live my life and not die of a stroke, a heart attack, a high blood pressure, all those things Chris mentioned. And then night number 2 comes along. She wakes up at 8, has a little something to eat, does some things around the house, goes to bed at 11 because that's when she likes to go to bed. And lo and behold, what happens? She's up again for a couple hours. I think that when you have the opportunity to sleep, That's a little bit of a different kind of sleep debt than you had the opportunity to take it away from you. So let's look at Mark. Mark has some sort of deadline that he's got to meet for his work. He's some sort of architect and got a demanding client, and he's got a full slate of other work. But he got that work done during the day, got home, had some dinner. And now he's like, look, this other client's coming and meeting me at the office at 8 a.m. I've got to have these sketches rendered a little bit more, I got the corrections that we wanted to make. I've got to get all those things done. So he stays up. He would have slept and probably gone to sleep immediately at 11 o'clock, but he's up until 2, 3 o'clock getting these sketches done, gets them done. They look great. Went to sleep, up at 7 or 8, goes to the office, meets with the client. Woo, he's exhausted. So I think that's a different kind of sleep debt, right? It's like you've got two friends and one's talking about how their money problems are all a thing, but they've got super rich parents that give them money all the time, versus that other friend you've got who's stressing about money and has a legitimate reason to stress about money because there's no backup plan there. So I think that Mark really needs to think about, okay, when over the next 7 days can you make up that sleep you lost with those architectural renderings, right? Because you would have slept, but something kept you from it. So I think from that cardiovascular perspective, you need to make that up because Mark never has any trouble falling asleep. Insomnia is not a thing he deals with. But if insomnia is a thing that you deal with, I think you have to be very careful with the concept of sleep debt and reading the research about all the terrible things that happen when we accrue it, because it might not necessarily apply to you. And to fully repay that debt can make it very difficult sometimes for you to fall asleep. And one final thing to think about, when we talked about debt, when we talked about that sleep credit card, I said, 49 hours a week, 56 hours a week. The defining of how much sleep you need, which we talked about in a previous episode, can really influence whether or not you think you've got a sleep debt. If you're somebody who thinks, look, Chris, I hear what you're saying, but I need 10 hours of sleep every night to feel my best, then you need to get 70 hours of sleep a week. And like we talked about in that podcast, that might not be in the cards for you. So I can promise you, there are a lot of listeners right now who are terrified of the cardiovascular outcomes that are coming their way from their massive sleep debt, but they don't really have a debt because they're not nearly sleeping at the deficiency that they think they are. It's kind of like, it's like people who worry about money, but they've got plenty of it. They're not bordering on poverty. They're not bordering on running out of money or debt. Their expectation of how much they have, how much they need to spend is a little bit skewed. So when you think about your sleep debt, I want you to think about, first and foremost, how much sleep do you actually need per night? And again, we've talked about that in a couple episodes previous. And from that number is where you're going to calculate your sleep debt. So somebody takes sleep away from you, or you go to I'm over here, go to Madison Square Garden, and we got tickets to every one of the Fish concerts, and we're going to go out and go crazy, and you're going to accrue the sleep debt. Then, yeah, I think after the concert's over and Trey and company have packed up, you need to find the time to make up that sleep. But if you're somebody struggling with insomnia and you had the opportunity to sleep, but your brain chose not to do it, it might be a good idea to ignore that sleep debt to some extent. So that's it. That's sleep debt done and dusted. My name is Chris Winter. You can get in touch with the show and tell us your great sleep debt stories, your opinions on fish, whatever you want to talk about. Dr. Chris Winter Instagram, Dr. Chris Winter Twitter. You can find our YouTube page where we post all the content. We will put Elvis Costello's song that we talked about earlier, Pay It Back, off of My Aim Is True on the Sleep Unplugged Spotify playlist, Volume 3. And until next week, sleep well.